Hey, everybody. Welcome to this Off the Cuff. I'm your host, Chris Martinson. Wednesday, June 10th. And, we had some Fed yabba today. So we're going to dissect some of that. We're going to talk about the market action, things economic, gold related, and hopefully a little farming in there. Because I've been turned into a farmer. We have John Rubino with us here today of dollarcollapse.com. John, welcome to
Hey,
the
Chris.
program. We're talking
Well,
resilience.
good to be back. You are a very resilient guy, I can tell.
Yeah, I am. I was just laying fertilizer down because we might get some rain. Been super dry, just unusually dry. Hardly any rain for a month now. So,
That is really unusual for where you are. Normally, this is the rainy season, right?
yeah, so that's just welcome to farming, right? So
Well,
I'm not depending on it entirely here.
Farming is a lot like coaching a sports team because there's everything is out of control. All the stuff that can make you a success or a failure is beyond your control a lot of the time. So with you, it's the weather.
Yeah,
With a coach, it's the best guy breaking his leg or whatever.
yeah,
But yeah, it's stressful. That's why they have futures contracts. That's why originally derivatives were good things,
yeah.
because they allowed farmers to lock in prices to keep them from having nervous breakdowns every time it rained or didn't rain or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad I'm not depending on it at this point. So this is first yearitis. Evie and I, we just moved in January. So it's just correcting a lot of past mistakes. People who weren't farmers lived here, so they didn't know how to, take care of fields and return nutrients. So, this is all soil samples, getting them run, figuring out where what we're short on, how to address that. And we're getting 4 cows are showing up in about a week.
Oh, okay.
And because that's what the land needs, we're growing beef cows, and so we've already got some names on some of these cows for people, but really it's to help the land get back into shape, sort of Joel Salatin style, mob crop them, run a bunch of cows, move them on, get the chickens to come in after that, and they're gonna rehabilitate the land for us, and I get hamburger at the end of it. So that's the plan.
That is the counterintuitive thing that they're discovering now, is that you need herds of grazers in order to keep land in shape, because that's how it originally happened. They would tear up the ground with their hooves, and then they would fertilize the ground, and it would be healthy. And you take that away, and you think you're helping the forestry grow or whatever, but it actually hurts it instead. So
yeah. So. And we're going to be documenting all of that, and maybe we'll make the next biggest little farm. Except I don't know what we're going to call that one. But I still feel like this is a really important thing to do, because I got to tell you, sure, it's unsettling seeing mobs and violence, riots, protesters, police behaving badly. But to me, you and I have been talking about this for a long time, whether it was the yellow vests in 2019 or Hong Kong most recently, in Chile, you've got protests, and nominally they all look different. But actually, I think they have the same underpinning, which is that a broad class of people no longer feel represented, or that they have the same economic opportunities they used to. And I want to talk about that second part, because I've just been I'm getting personal about it now. I am shaming, naming, blaming Jerome Powell directly, because it's not the Fed anymore. It's this guy, and somebody takes his place, it'll be that person, right? Because they are just absolutely creating the worst possible outcome at the worst time, a giant wealth gap. They shove money in the markets go up, the rich get richer. So on a percentage basis, if the economy's down 40%, which I think it is, by some recent estimates, and their share and stock equity has gone up by a factor of 40 or 50%, it means effectively their ownership has doubled of the rich people. Those who own equities, their share of the pie just doubled during a really desperately hard time. I think that's morally reprehensible. I think that's on Jerome Powell. I think you can't defend it from a monetary standpoint, a social standpoint, a political or a moral standpoint. I think it's just wrong. What do you think?
Well, it is amazing, isn't it? Because maybe the only good thing that came from the Great Depression was all the rich guys jumping out of their buildings and hitting the sidewalk, because so at least the pain was spread around. But this time, like you said, yeah, the rich are continuing to get richer as we descend into what might be a depression. That is just astounding. But as for the Fed and the government right now, they're doing all they feel like they can do. They only have this one tool, right? I mean, they have met every crisis since Well, since I had black hair, at least, with easy money,
Yeah.
and it's worked in their terms, because in other words, it got them through the rest of the business cycle, and or out of the recession that they were in or whatever, or they avoided the big banks going bankrupt. In other words, it succeeded in terms of the immediate goals. So they think it works, and they assume it's going to work again this time, I think. I mean, there's no way to know what's really going through the heads of people who are at that level in the financial community, because they got there by being delusional. And actually that's a question that I get a lot, and it's one that I've always thought about all the way through this is, are the people in charge just complete morons who are blundering in the direction of that cliff that we're going to go off, or are they actually evil geniuses carrying out a 50-year plan that's going to end with all of us enslaved by a tiny handful of super rich people? And I don't know which is more scary, but assuming for a minute that these guys actually believe what they're doing is the right thing to do, then they're going to keep doing it because it's their only tool, and it has worked in the past for them. So when Jerome Powell says, "Oh yeah, we'll keep interest rates at this level for another year, and we see the economy recovering in 2021," what he's really saying is just kick back, and we'll give you negative interest rates when the time comes. Okay, we'll do what we have to do, and that is what they'll have to do. This is nowhere near over. And the bad debt that we took on after the last, the past 30 years mismanagement is still there. And now it's been joined by another 10 trillion or so dollars of debt worldwide from the past 3 months. So this stuff, to the extent that we had debt-related problems before, we've got even bigger ones now that have to be addressed with even more sharply negative interest rates and even bigger government deficits. So what's happening now is going to be magnified in the next few years. There's no way we get out of this and go back to normal life, just because you can never raise interest rates in a world this heavily indebted, right? So if we can't raise interest rates, then that means we have no choice but to continue with epically easy money, which encourages more and more people to borrow, which means debt is going to soar, and so on, until we hit that brick wall or go off the cliff, or whatever your favorite metaphor for the end of this world is. But that's the end of this process. And there is no interim end, like there's no return to normalcy this time around, I don't think.
Well, what's at the end of that road besides, currency collapse, right? Dollar collapse.
Yeah,
What else is there?
that is the end of the road, when they no longer can use these currencies to play these games. And then everybody recognizes that it was a game, and the only tool that they had to play the game is no longer working, and everything hits the fan at that point. So maybe, the form of the collapse is open to debate, right?
Yeah.
Sort of like in Ghostbusters, when you have to choose the form of your destruction. So we still kind of have that ahead of us. That's our last remaining choice, is how does this blow up? And is it the peasants with the pitchforks, like we're seeing right now, just burning down the status quo? Or is it a currency collapse followed by some kind of monetary reset that puts us back on a sustainable path, but at the cost of a massive bout of inflation that impoverishes everybody else except the rich, again, and then we somehow talk the peasants into not picking up their pitchforks. But those seem to be our only choices. There's no way out of this that's pain-free and that represents a return to the quote unquote normality of the 1970s and 80s and 90s. We can never get back there because we've taken on 3 or 4 times as much debt as we had back then.
Yeah, it's been rather astonishing to me to just watch how our managers, because they're not leaders, how the national managers have just basically everything they said they stood for, they just chucked it right out the window when stuff happened. But one thing they didn't chuck out the window was their overwhelming proclivity to throw money at their big rich donors on the first hand. So the political people out there, whether it's Pelosi on one side or McConnell on the other, or whoever you're looking at in this story, they share a united idea that the big fat companies are going to get the most benefit out of this stuff right away. So here's my view of the bailouts, the rescue plans, the stimulus, whatever you call it. It's just a funnel like this. 300 billion went out in stimulus checks, but they still haven't even all gone out, right? The last of those are going to be shipped out in September, I think. They're just dribbling those out. Like they're draining a 500-gallon tank with a 1/4-inch hose on that. But oh my gosh, Citadel got bailed out of its basis trades even before coronavirus hit. Most people don't know this. So Citadel's a big hedge fund. Ben Bernanke works there now. He's former Fed chairperson. And wouldn't you know it, they blew up on a basis trade where they were capturing free money between the actual value of a treasury and what it yielded and the future price of a treasury. So they were playing this game, and it was just a few basis points, a basis point being 1/100%. It was free money. They're just minting free money. Mint, 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 mint. And then it blew up on them. And of course, the Fed says, gosh, this would be unfortunate if we had markets became dysfunctional, which is their way of saying it would be unfortunate if our buddies lost a few bucks because they were making money. Wouldn't it be terrible if they lost money? They bailed them out. They bailed out the holders of mortgage-backed securities. They picked BlackRock to administer the plan. And BlackRock's like, oh, I know what to do. Y'all should buy JNK. That happens to be a junk fund that we administer, right? So watching these people, it's just been instant, John. Massive bailouts for the rich and the well-connected. Billions, if not $1 trillion now flowing towards making sure that big, super, super wealthy, well-connected, ultra profitable hedge funds, private equity funds, all of that didn't lose any money in this cycle. So that part is the same as every other part. Of course, if you read Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin's book, you discover that's been the name of the game, right? Privatize profits, socialize losses, and I don't think people understand how those losses are going to be socialized, but I know you do. So the Fed's got a lot of dodgy stuff on its balance sheet. The Treasury Department now has a levered special purpose vehicle slew of awesomeness, and they're going to lose money on that, and that means the taxpayer, right?
Well, our government is now buying junk bonds.
Yeah.
It's I guess the biggest buyer of junk bonds now in the world. But two other things. One is from a political standpoint. You know, this was a huge mess. All of these programs that didn't work right and were inadequate, and all Trump had to do was embrace universal basic income and give everybody $2,000 a month for the next year. And that would have been it. He could have gone golfing for the next 3 months after that, you know, and his reelection would have been assured, and the economy would have remained kind of stable as we get through the lockdown and everything. But for some reason, well, I guess, you know, Republicans don't think in those terms, right? And Democrats also don't either, because you saw the bill that the House sent to the Senate, right? Where this hasn't been passed yet, but it was what the House designed as their bailout bill. And the most notable feature of it was a bailout for the, oh God, K Street. Who am I talking about here?
Which lobbyist?
Yeah, the lobbyists. That's right. It was a bailout for the organization that lobbies for the lobbyists. That is in the Democrats' bailout bill, you know, the stimulus bill. So you know that nobody has your back in that kind of a world, right? When the party of, supposedly the party of working people, of the little guy, makes it a point to bail out not just the lobbyists, but the lobbyists for the lobbyists. You know, we're alone here, right?
We're on our own.
We are on our own.
All adrift.
And you know, that makes it doubly frustrating. That was such an easy fix, at least from a political standpoint. I mean, had we done the UBI thing and given everybody $2,000 a month or whatever for a year or whatever, we would have had all the debt that would have been associated with that to deal with later, which we do anyhow. You know, we borrowed a ton of money regardless, but we could have done it in a way that would have probably would have eliminated the protests, or at least lowered their scale this time around, because they basically had two reasons. One is these videos that keep coming out of white cops killing black guys over and over and over again. You know, you cannot have that be the main diet of YouTube videos for a big segment of the population without them being in the streets just as they are. That's completely justified and completely understandable. But this time around, we had the lockdown at the same time, which was insanely frustrating for so many people. Because, if you work online, a lockdown is an inconvenience, but not life-threatening. But if you work in a service industry or pretty much anywhere else, and you're in a city, and they tell you, stay in your apartment with your spouse and your grandma and your two kids and this other kid that's been staying with you and can't go anywhere now, and you're in a one-bedroom apartment and you're broke, you can't even put food on the table, you're going to explode, right? And that's a big part of what's happening right now, is people are so frustrated by this unjust house arrest that has been imposed on them. And without going into the necessity of it, because I'm not a scientist and I can't judge that about whether it was necessary or not. And I think it's obvious that it was necessary, but it still frustrated the hell out of these people and led to a big part of the civil unrest that we saw. So giving them money directly that would have at least allowed them to pay their bills and feed their kids would have moderated a lot of the frustration. And, that seems so politically obvious, but it wasn't something that anybody in Washington grasped, which, they had their chance to behave correctly, like reasonable people.
Yep. Keep going.
Okay.
I got to close the door.
Oh, okay. And they didn't do it. So, now we know. we know what the political system does under crisis, and that is it takes care of itself and its benefactors. So now, besides the financial reason for some kind of a revolution here, we've got a very clear political reason, because nobody represents 70% of the population anymore.
But it's been that way for a long time, right? So you just mentioned a couple of things. Sure, there's been police brutality and black people. Absolutely, we're on more of the receiving end of that. But we had civil asset forfeiture, which is deeply unfair. We had no-knock raids where people of all color were getting like their doors beaten down. And when the police would do those things and had some, a mistake happen, they had the wrong house, or, really egregious cases, came out where, they were using bad information that turned out to be made up and stuff, and then they would lie. The worst part about that is how the police themselves, who were supposed to be policing themselves, they said, no, we'll take care of this. We don't want anybody else doing this. We got it. And then they would investigate themselves and never find any wrongdoing, right? And all of that other stuff. But we had the healthcare rackets going on. Here's how many people through all of coronavirus were bankrupted in Europe because of medical bills, right? Goose egg, zero. Mm-hmm. Million or maybe 2 million families are going to get bankrupted by this whole thing because of a predatory sick care system, right? You have minimum wage that's not even keeping up. You got colleges in on the whole racket system, squeezing people with loans for $65,000 for what, and on and on and on. And I think that, the lockdown was just sort of like that was like pulling people's leg hairs out at the end of a long string of like treating them badly. It was too much. I get it. But I don't think things just erupted because of George Floyd was a spark for sure. Lockdown's a spark, but man, decades of tinder built up, and it's built on this idea of structural unfairness. And that's what humans we're primates. We don't like unfair. It's been very unfair for a long time. Neither party's been caring about fairness for a while, I think, my judgment.
Yeah. And the point of view of the sound money community, which is basically where I'm coming from, is that we can trace this inequality back to going off the gold standard in 1971, because at that point, from then on, when the Fed wanted to finance government borrowing, it just created money out of thin air, handed it to the big banks, who then handed it to their preferred customers. So those guys got richer faster than anybody else. And since that time, the imbalances have been growing to the point where, let's say 20 years or so ago, the banking industry basically just captured the government and now owns it, along with the military industrial complex. So now there's not even the pretense of trying to enact policies that spread the wealth around. Now it's strictly, everything we do is going to enrich the 1%. And then maybe a little bit it'll work its way down to you, but the money goes first to the richest already. And it took people a long time to see that. I mean, it takes a long time for opinions to form and for ideas to change. But I think people are coming around now. And there's a critical mass who get it, who see that the system is structurally unfair. And they're not going to take it anymore. You know, Bernie Sanders came very close to being the Democrat nominee twice in a row here. And Donald Trump, who ran on a populist platform, actually won. And the reason he won is he spoke the language of the dispossessed. And so did Bernie Sanders. You know, they spoke directly to the people who are being left behind, and that resonated. So it really doesn't matter who wins the next presidential election, because what Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump did was show that there is a market for populist political ideas. And so somebody is going to come along who is younger and a little less radical than Bernie Sanders, or more personable than Donald Trump, but he's going to say a lot of the same things and win in a landslide. And at that point, we'll find out how deep it goes in the deep state. You know, are they just going to assassinate that guy who starts trying to redress all these wrongs, or will they stand back and let it happen? And you know, I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out, but I'm not optimistic that any of it works. But that's the trend now. And you know, you can say that when you screw your finances up, you end up screwing up your politics. And I think that's true. And that's the way it's going here. And then it becomes a feedback loop where your screwed up politics in turn screw up your finances, and so on until everything blows up. So it does feel, you know, like we're not far from this. And I problem with that is I've been saying it since like 2005 or so. You know, I thought the system was ready to go before, when the housing bubble burst in the last decade.
Yeah.
And it came close, but it didn't. It did not blow up. So, you know, it's hard to say with any kind of certainty that it's going to blow up this time. But God, where do we go from here? You know, what do we do to save the system when the final crisis comes?
Yeah. Well, I'm convinced that economically, there is no V-shaped recovery on this whole thing. There'll be a dead cat bounce there because, you know, once people are let back out, and I think the protests showed that maybe the state governments didn't really care all that much about keeping people locked down, you know, and so I don't think that escaped anybody's notice. So good luck trying to get people corralled again, you know, next time. I think there's a second wave of this virus coming around. I think we see the early data on that. It's coming, and I think as well we're going to see a lot of new cases coming out of all these protests. A lot of people were in masks. I was glad to see that, but a lot of people weren't. And by the way, you know, in the thick of it all, when people were really marching, moving, and all that, masks tend to fall down. So I think we'll see a slew of infections. We'll have to see how that plays out. But beyond that, for myself, I can feel how my behavior has changed, and I don't think I'm going to be getting on a cruise anytime soon. I'm going to fly a lot less. I'm probably going to eat out a lot less. My behavior, I feel, has changed because of this now. And I think a lot of people that will be in the same case. And the most significant change I think people are going to undergo is this idea of not taking on a lot of debt themselves at the personal level. And I think, you know, saving up for a rainy day and all kinds of things. I feel like this was a defining generational sort of a moment which will endure, not for everybody, but for enough that's a significant percentage. It's 80-20, 80% just go right back, snap right back. But I think 20% have been shifted. And so I don't think we get a snapback recovery. And I think certain industries are just toast at this point in time, how they've been configured. So that's how I see it right now. I think this is going to be a really long thing. I'm not expecting to get any good read on really how long this is going to take for 6 more months, probably.
Well, and a lot of people are just flat out broke now. So even if they go back to work, they've been dipping into their savings, presumably.
Yeah, good point.
To pay for life, which means that they do need that 6 months that you're talking about just to get back to where they were before the pandemic hit.
Hmm.
and they are not going to be going on any cruises or eating in high-end restaurants or anything for a while, and assuming they ever will again. So yeah, segments of the economy are going to take a really long time to come back if they ever do come back. But other segments, the whole homesteading thing is huge now. Like, the demand for rural land is off the charts, and all the
Are you seeing
gear
that
that
out your
goes with
way at
stuff.
all? The demand
Um,
for land? We're seeing it a lot out our way.
yeah, yeah. There's a. I was in Idaho before we just moved to Washington State, and I'm not paying too much attention to the trends here, but in Idaho, it was huge. There were people from other states moving in and buying, 5 acres on the edge of town and with a little farmhouse on it, and they were going to put in pigs and cows and things like that, it was pretty cool to see it happen, because um, the homesteading self-sufficiency trend was already in place for other reasons, and now this just turbocharged it, because um, urban life was always pretty stressful, but now it's gotten doubly stressful, right? Because you never know when the next pandemic is coming, and you're going to be sitting on the subway when it happens. When you see it on your phone, and you don't want that to happen if you can help it, right? You'd rather be out someplace with fresh air and where you have some control over your food supply. So all of a sudden, that lifestyle, which seemed too hard and too alien to a lot of people for a long time, suddenly looks intriguing. So we're going to see a shift in population, I think, because of this, out of the cities, which, by the way, might just offset inflows, because we were urbanizing before that. And there are cross currents in all of these big trends and everything, but there's definitely going to be an increase in demand for high quality, low stress land in rural areas. In other words, places where you don't have to cut down a forest in order to put your cabin, where there's already a house there, and
Mhm.
and there's already water and electricity and stuff like that. There will be a lot of demand for places like that, and I think that's a good thing. We should have always been a society where most people were self-sufficient, at least in some way. At least gave lip service and did a few things, because urban gardens were getting very big before this hit too. So people were already doing that, but I think they'll do it on a bigger scale now, and it's a good thing. And it means that some companies will do okay, like Home Depot. The guys who sell the picks and shovels for the homesteading trend are going to do just fine. But high-end restaurants, cruise ships, airlines, they got a long way ahead of them before they get
Yeah.
back to anything resembling normal.
Yeah. As a quick aside on all of that, one of the companies, all the companies that we buy from, Johnny Seeds, Fedco, Seeds of Solidarity, they're all out. They're just like out of stock. And Fedco put up this emergency thing about a month ago on their science site and said, we're not even taking orders for 2021 until late October. Don't even, just stop contacting us. Right.
See, now
So
that must be really frustrating for them, because they were perfectly positioned for what's coming,
yeah,
and then they can't get inventory when it happens, and they have
right.
to turn everybody away. I can't imagine what that's be like, what that would be like, because you're right in every way
Yeah.
except the inventory thing,
Except that I know.
yeah, except that inventory thing.
I know. So that's one of the decisions we're making here. We've got this beautiful property with a really nice field, and what's the highest best use? And we're putting animals on it to rehabilitate it. But I'd like to bring in a young couple who can think of something. And one of the ideas I've had is like in the movie with Dustin Hoffman, The Graduate, where that guy leans in and says one word: plastics. Right? Me, that one word: heirloom seed production. It's a
Mhm.
phrase, but I think that might be like a big thing going forward, because I really think this is huge. People going back to the land, and it's at least in part because they found out cities are not where you want to be in a pandemic. Who knows when another one's coming along, but it's not where you want to be if riots are breaking out. But all more than that, I think what COVID did is it broke the spell for people, where they've been home long enough, they found out what's important, they detached from their job, which many people discovered was actually soul destroying and just a time wasting, way of being on a treadmill, a hamster wheel, or whatever you call it, and have decided, nah, not for me, right? And so there turns out there aren't that many 5-acre spreads for sale in the whole country, compared to I think the percentage of people who would want to gravitate out of a more urban environment. So I actually think there's going to be quite a mismatch in demand and supply for a while. Because people aren't really going to want to move like 6 hours out to Idaho or Iowa or something like that. They're going to want to be 2 hours outside of Manhattan, or something like that. So I actually think little rims around major cities are going to be really sought after for a while, and very hard to come by for a bit.
Well, Chris, if you start advertising for tenant farmers,
yeah,
you will be deluged with millennial couples who want to do that, because who can't afford to do it on their own, but they can do it if you have it all set up for them.
Yeah.
And they pay you a cut of whatever it is they produce there. So that's going to be easy if you decide to do that.
Well, that's probably the direction we're going. So we just have to decide how to configure all of this stuff, and we're making the decision whether we're going to stay in this house or live in that one over there. And because this property came with two, and it's just trying to get our arms around the scale of this project, which is huge. But I'm really clear about it. I want to be the person who found it and had the capital, and I'll do everything I possibly can. But I really need a young couple who's got a strong dream here and a way to really maximize this. So, because I think it's the way of the future. I honestly do. I really think even if we U-shape, I don't actually think we recover all the way to way things were. I think it's a whole new world. And part of that model for me, John, is that I don't think shale oil is ever going to come back to its heyday of total in aggregate, offshore, onshore, lower 48, 13 million barrels a day. I think that's the permanent high watermark. It would take a miracle in a frenzy of drilling to get back up to that. People have discovered that it was a kind of a mistake all the way through, huge capital destruction. I actually think we'll nationalize it at some point. But even with all of that, that's it. And by the way, most people don't know this. We were never really in a position of being a net oil exporter. So some ledger domain around terms and things, net energy, self-sufficient, blah, blah, blah. But we're going to still be a net oil importing country for, I think, ever. And I think that we discover in this story that your energy is everything. And I don't think we're going back to those old heights, which is probably fine for a while, because we probably won't need diesel, jet fuel, things like that in the same quantities. But ultimately, I think that was it. I think that was our high watermark. I can't see how we get back to it.
Well, we kind of already bailed out the shale oil guys when we bought up all their junk bonds, right? Because they had financed themselves with junk that was going to blow up this year. The whole industry was going to just evaporate if we have the kind of deep recession it looks like we're going to have. And so the government stepped in preemptively and saved the shale oil guys, at least for another year. It's not clear. Like you said, it's not clear that that's ever economic again.
So did Robinhood, though, the little trader app that the millennials are said to be using, right? Because Chesapeake, CHK ticker symbol, it went from like $6 they're readying the paperwork, right, to $65 a share, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it backed off some. But in that moment, and this is bad of me, I kind of hope Chesapeake took the opportunity to toss some equity out into the market. But whoever was like buying a bankrupt company, with a multi-100% return on it, there's no possible way for everybody to trade into that, make money, and get out of it again. We saw that with Hertz. We saw that with airline companies. All these people piling into fundamentally bankrupt, cash flow, upside down companies, and I don't think they understand that that's a Jack be nimble, Jack be quick story. Because if you can get in and get out, you could make a few bucks, but it's literally impossible for everybody to get in and get out and make money on a bankrupt company through equity. It's just how the math doesn't support it. So crazy times.
Yeah, that whole millennials buying bankrupt companies thing is something I've been seeing headlines about, but not really understanding. But it does look like that a lot of people went from Bitcoin directly to equities without completely understanding the differences between those things. They see a cheap stock where they recognize the name and just buy the hell out of it, not realizing that it's bankrupt and might be worth nothing.
Or is worth nothing.
Is worth nothing
to the equity holders, right?
Yeah. So when you're in your 20s, you have to do stupid stuff in the stock market, right? That's when you make your really egregious mistakes. And I guess there's a generation doing that right now, but wow, they're doing it in a way that looks like it could have been avoided pretty easily if they had just asked one baby boomer for advice, one old guy who's seen a few things about whether they should buy Hertz after Hertz declared bankruptcy or not.
Yeah. But we would have said no. And
exactly.
And some of them made bank. But here's the thing. There's going to be a lot of tears on the back end of that, because it's not possible for everybody to make money on a bankrupt company through equity.
Well, Chris, in this world, the Fed might buy these bankrupt companies at some really high price, So the thing about today's world is that the old dumb money is no longer the dumbest money. It used to be that retail investors and corporations buying back their stock in the open market were the dumb money. The guys who bought at the peak of cycles without regard for price and then got killed in the next downturn. But now you've got central banks with basically unlimited printing presses coming in and buying stocks and junk bonds without a second thought for how much those things are actually worth. The Fed doesn't have any security analysts there going, okay, the PE ratio on Caterpillar is this, and on Boeing it's that. So I think we should overweight on Caterpillar. There's nobody doing anything like that. They're just buying the S&P 500 with newly created currency. So, in this kind of world, it's hard to say with certainty that anything is a bad investment, because you don't know what the Fed is going to buy next. And when they do, it might completely change the terms of that investment. And so, when I even saw a headline a while ago about central banks are going to start buying gold really aggressively again. I mean, they're already buying gold, but they're going to ramp it up, which would be a nice use for dumb money, don't you think? Finally, they're buying something that actually has some value.
I mean, you'd think these companies have value too, but you look at the prospects for Apple, good company, but their prospects are way down and their stock price is way up. So the price you have to pay for that is really, really high.
Well, Chris, that's the Swiss central bank buying Apple.
Yeah.
That's their favorite stock. So,
yeah,
and they're not paying attention to Apple's future sales or anything. They just like iPhones or whatever. But that means you can you don't have to have great prospects if somebody with unlimited money for some reason likes you, and your stock can go way up. So I don't know. I really see, my impulse is to short the hell out of this market. And I do have some shorts out there, but it feels like this is one of those big short times when you should be just mortgaging the house and betting against equities. We're in a recession. We're having the first ever asset bubble within a recession. Those things never happen. And so you should short that, right? But you've got the dumbest money in the world and the biggest money in the world on the other side of that bet. So there's no way to know when and if that ever works again.
The most sociopathic money, because it has a huge impact, creating a wealth gap. And the Fed is doing that. That's been their goal all along. They don't say it's their goal, but it absolutely is their goal, is to make the rich richer. So the billionaires apparently are up $500 billion in notional net worth in this period. And for the 40 million people out of work who are tapping into their last few bucks of savings and hoping that their unemployment doesn't run out in about a month, because then they don't know what they're going to do. There's not a conversation about that even happening amongst again, I got to use the managers, not the leaders, because there aren't any leaders. But where's even that one person in Congress or in the Senate saying, what are you doing? They had Scott Pelley on 60 Minutes, had Jerome Powell. Jerome looked pretty awful for that interview, I thought. It's like, gosh, you guys are just printing money. Like, yeah, that's kind of what we're doing. Where's the follow-up question? Great. Who receives it when you print it? Well, we buy stuff in the market. What do you buy? Well, we buy mortgage-backed securities. From who? Well, like you just follow that down, right? And eventually there's a person at the end of that,
Yeah.
And they just don't do it. Just like, oh, in markets, like it's this mysterious chasm that stuff goes into, but they never follow the questions, and just drives me nuts, because the most important question I would ask would be this. I would say, Jerome, you're creating a wealth gap. Currently, the top 1% owns about 60% of all assets right now. Are you going to stop when the top 1% owns 80% of the assets, or 99% of the assets? Or is it when the 0.1% owns 100% of everything? I mean, there's a limit. Where is it? You guys must have drawn the line. Tell us where the line is, so we know how much social inequity you're aiming for, because we'd like to know.
Where is Ron Paul when we need him? Because even back in the day, before things got as crazy as they are now, the hearings when the Fed would come before Congress were a blast because of him.
Yeah.
He would actually ask the questions you're talking about there. He would say, "Is gold money?" And they would squirm, and there's nobody doing that now, because either they're all bought and paid for, or they just flat out don't understand this stuff. And I think, not understanding it is completely possible, because they've never had to understand the role of money in a financial system, and what happens when you mess with the supply and demand equation. And they've never had to think in those terms, because they never lived through anything like that. So I think this is going to be an educational process for a lot of people, but as you said, it's clearly not going to stop, because the guys who are doing it don't seem to get that it has to stop at some point. They literally think they can do this forever. Because remember, modern monetary theory hasn't actually won yet, and it's still out there, where the idea of governments borrowing and taxing and stuff like that really don't make any sense in today's world, when you can just create as much money as you want to. So modern monetary theory, which is gaining adherence all the time now, says, well, let's just have the government print as much money as it needs and finance itself that way. So we'll skip all the stuff you and I are talking about. Oh, the deficit, this, and debt, that, and QE, this. That all goes away, and then you just have direct money printing. And of course, the fatal flaw in that theory is the phrase, as much money as they need, because the government's needs will become endless as soon as you give them that kind of an unlimited credit card. But we haven't even gotten there yet, so we still have phases of crazy still to come.
Phases of crazy.
Yeah. We're not done yet. We haven't hit peak crazy in the financial markets. And when that happens, you got to hope that some area of the financial market rebels against it and sees it for what it is. But if the government is creating as much money as it needs in order to prop up the financial markets, it's possible that that nobody rebels. There are no bond vigilantes anymore, and it just goes on until the last thing they can't control, which is the value of the currency, finally breaks down, and this all ends. But I think you and I have stuff to talk about for quite a while. We're going to be sitting here going, "Can you believe what happened this week?" for a long time to come.
Well, if we're not at peak crazy, what's crazier than current? What do we got?
Well, modern monetary theory.
Okay.
Where we do away with the whole idea of taxation and government borrowing, and they just print money and spend it, which is what we're already doing. But they'll get rid of the fig leaf and start doing that, and they'll be just unshackled. There will be no limit to how much government can spend then, because they're totally in control of the process. Universal basic income, where everybody gets income from life from the government, income for life from the government. Again, just created out of thin air. We won't even be talking about deficits at that point. We'll just make the money and give it to people. And probably some other stuff that I haven't thought of yet, but I'll think about it. And next time we talk, I'll have some more examples. But those two things are part of a seamless new age monetary system, where you basically give everybody money and you create that money out of thin air on the assumption that the currency that you're using to do all this will hold its value. And as long as that assumption is true, you can get away with this stuff. And as soon as that assumption stops being true, everything you're doing grinds to a halt. And if you look back at, for instance, the 1970s, which is our most recent currency crisis in the US, you see that that can happen in a hurry. You know, it only takes, well, it took 6 or 7 years back then for us to be in a full-blown currency crisis where we thought the dollar was going to zero, and we had to raise interest rates to 20%, or between 15 and 20%, depending on the interest rate, in order to save us. This time around, we can't raise interest rates because everybody's so indebted that it would bankrupt huge sections of the global economy. So we can't do that. But we're in much worse shape than we were in the 1970s. So it's easy to envision a currency crisis coming along on internet time. You know, all of a sudden, you know, 3 weeks from whatever, back when we thought everything was okay, we're in crisis. And they have no way out. You know, the currency is collapsing. They don't know what to do about it. And it's game over. So, you know, that's out there, but it's not clear whether it's this year, next year, or 5 years from now. But with something like that coming, you really need to be preparing for it because, and again, as we've talked about on previous shows, this is really an investment thesis, right? We can't control any of the stuff we're talking about. It's all going to happen. And it might happen sooner, it might happen later, it might happen quickly, it might happen slowly, but it's going to happen. So you need to be ready for it. And how do you prepare in this kind of a world? So, you know, the first thing obviously is self-sufficiency. What you're doing right now, in other words, the whole homesteading thing, mm-hmm. is a really important part of what most people's plans should be. And then financially, you know, switching out of these currencies that are being actively destroyed by their governments and into things like gold and silver that governments can't make more of is the main financial step that you want to take. So you do those two things. In other words, have some control over your food supply, mm-hmm. and have a financial portfolio that is actually going to hold its value or go up in a currency crisis. And you're most of the way there. You know, there are other things you should be doing, but those are two of the really big resiliency things that people should be doing.
You know, my very well said. The mental image I have of this is that the Fed felt a little shimmy in the car, so they steered over, and that was 1994 when we had a little hiccup in the corporate bond market. So they oversteered a little, did away with reserve requirements for banks, the banks just had too much money to lend. They put it into the stock market. We got long-term capital management, little swerve back to the other side. You know, we had the crash of the dot-com bubbles. They overcorrected on that side. Now the car is really starting to, you know, pitch and yaw on the road. And then back in 2007 and back again here now. And they're just swerving wildly. And you can feel the amplitude of this out of control car's movements, you know, increasing as we're going along here. And the question is, well, where are we going? Right? Again, you know, Scott Pelley, 60 Minutes ought to be saying, well, all right, Jerome, let's imagine you can get this car back on the road. Where's it going? Like, what is this path? And it's just always more of the same. We're just going to continue on with more of the same. But every single trend where you say, well, we're increasing our debt at twice the rate of GDP. That's just a math problem, right? Eventually, you have to revert that, and GDP has to increase faster than debt for a period of time. But nobody has that as a model. Part of the planning system. So I'm just looking at all this, and I think it's part of why we see people in the street intuitively or cognitively. People have sort of said, this story just doesn't make any sense. Right? It just doesn't add up, you know? And that's the problem. Whether we put a new layer and we call it MMT or we call it something else, do we get more craziness? The problem is the main narrative just doesn't make sense, you know, which is we have a hyper fragile, interconnected world system that just got a major shock. It was due for one anyway. We can't grow infinitely on a finite planet. There's all kinds of reasons you can come to say this story needed to change. And my main complaint, the reason I really hate that the Federal Reserve is busy just trying to make the NASDAQ go to new all-time highs, which they've been successful at, is that's the old story, right? That's the same old thing they've already done multiple times, steering into the ditch, you know, and this one will be even worse. And I decry the fact that this time when we go off, you know, I don't think there's any correcting and getting back on the road. This time you steer your money ship into the ditch, and everybody has a really bad number of generations. Kind of like, you know, when the Romans pulled out of Europe. It's kind of a bad deal for about 400 years. Kind of stank, right? I want to avoid that, and I feel like, John, that's exactly where we're heading. I can feel us being steered into a ditch. because they can't think of anything else to do besides the same thing they've been doing without anybody asking the larger question, which is, I see you decoupled from gold in 71. I see you've been growing debt at twice the rate of income or GDP since then. Is your plan really that we're just going to keep doing that forever? Because if so, you fail basic math. So, you need Ron Paul to bust out the basic math chart. Look at this hockey stick compared to this line. These sticks are going apart, And that's been my main complaint about this is it just doesn't make any sense. So protest away, people. You're right. This isn't like a good system. This system needs a shaken because it doesn't make sense even.
I like the car metaphor. You know that country song, Jesus Take the Wheel?
Yeah.
Okay, that might be our theme song when this all starts. But yeah, I think a lot of people have learned exactly the opposite lesson from what you're talking about, and that lesson that they think they've learned is that this works, and the whole debt thing turned out to be something we really didn't have to worry about because we've been borrowing money for such a long time, and look, we're still here. And the lesson the thing they take from that is that we can just do this again and again and again, basically forever, and we don't have to worry about it. And so I think we have to allow that to happen, or not allow it as if we have any control over it. But I think the system has to allow that final parabolic thing happen where debt just spikes, which is where we are now. It's going straight up, and every other measure of financial fragility, derivatives and emerging market debt, you name it, it's also doing the same thing as overall debt, and that has to happen to convince, and then something has to flow from that, some really big crisis that gets the attention of the people who thought the debt could go up ad infinitum without any consequence. And that's when the phase change happens, when everybody, when a critical mass of people at least, come to the conclusion that this isn't working anymore, and the reason that it's not working is the correct reason that it's not working. In other words, we took on too much debt, we borrowed too much money, and that always and everywhere screws up your life. Whether you're an individual or a family or a company or a country, you cannot borrow beyond a certain point without your life spinning out of control. And that's kind of a basic commonsensical thing that since we got off the gold standard, since we gave ourselves an unlimited credit card, that we've forgotten. That basic piece of common sense really isn't seen as a legitimate guide for living by an awful lot of people these days, or as a legitimate guide for governing. But financial rules, economic rules, the laws of life can be violated for a while, and they can be bent, but they can't be broken. And eventually they impose their will on whoever's messing with them, and that'll come, But I think that there is money to be made along the way. Gold and silver are up dramatically today. The mining stocks are doing great. There are 10 baggers out there in the junior gold mining sector. And you only need a few 10 baggers in an investing career to have basically been successful at it. And they're out there right now. So what we're talking about is in most ways really depressing, but I find it really energizing because it's easy to see how you can make a ton of money from all of this, and then use that money to protect your family and your friends and yourself. You can at least build a little bubble around the people you care about if you invest successfully for the crisis that's coming. And I think that's, we can't fix it, we can't stop it, but we can control our own finances in our own lives and at least set them up so that we're there to help when the time comes.
Yep. Physical, financial, emotional. You're talking about the financial side. But resilience, is taking some of that money and making sure you got, like, I feel really good about putting money into the soil here, and these cows might be the most expensive hamburger I haven't yet eaten, because it's going to be a lot to put up fencing and a shelter and buying hay if I'm going to overwinter them and all that stuff. But it's what the land needs. And it feels like a really good use of my money is to have the cows out there getting this land up, because I don't know what's coming, but every instinct I have, John, says get that land as productive as possible, right? It's nobody ever says, gosh, I really hate having this really rich soiled field that's super productive. That's terrible. Wish I hadn't done that. So that's the plan right now, because I do think this gets darker before it gets better. And I'm not even sure what the time frame is on that statement, but like the idea that my country couldn't even wrap its tiny brain around wearing face masks as a first line of defense to prevent the spread of something, so that we could have gotten back to work sooner, quicker, and all of that. We couldn't even manage that logic tells me that we're going to do rather poorly with the slightly more subtle and complicated things like what do you do with a ruined shale industry, or how do you undo the fact that the Democrats are bailing out the lobbyists, or whatever the story is, right? Like, it's just like, I've lost faith that our managers are going to be able to grok the story and its complexity and make good decisions. It feels like everything they're doing is just either random or a throwback to the past or something, which tells me this is going to take a while to sort out. And as that happens, I see things unwinding further.
Yeah, and it might take a while to, for instance, get your cows straightened out, so that it's actually an economic thing to do.
Yeah.
But look at pictures of Venezuela grocery stores, and all of a sudden, what you're putting into having an uninterrupted food supply seems like a bargain.
Yeah.
And I think it will be seen as a bargain when things get that bad, because the numbers kind of say they will get that bad at some point, where we already had food shortage, or we still do kind of sort of have food shortages right now, but it's possible that it gets much worse in the next crisis, because the next one will be bigger than this one. And you really want to be able to feed yourself. If you can do that, you should do that. And it doesn't have to be 5 acres far away from a city. You can have a rooftop garden. I watched a TV show the other day where somebody had a series of bags hanging out their window near the fire escape in a city, and there were plants growing in those bags. And they referred to that as some kind of a garden. They were growing food that way. So you can do stuff like that. From wherever you are, there's something you can do that is a step in the right direction. And now is absolutely the time to be taking that first step, because we might have years. We might have weeks or months, but we might have years. And if we have years, then you've got time to become a lot more resilient. So I think that's the lesson that most people should be drawing from this, is that wherever you are, you need to take that first step and then plan the second step. And don't worry about the crazy things that are happening around you. Just take those steps, and hopefully you'll be in a good place when you really need to be in that place.
Yeah. And I'll tell you the other kind of shocking thing for me, and very well said. And of course, I very much support the idea of people getting gardens, and I hope you got one going.
My wife's lobbying for one, so I might have to go back to being a farmer here.
Yeah, let's do it.
And that's yeah. The only thing I've ever successfully grown, blackberries. They are awesome because they're weeds. They will grow anywhere, and so one of my on my to-do list is to extend that whole blackberry thing into other things I can eat. So
that's good. Blackberries is good. If you got the green thumb for the blackberries, that's fine. If you ever watched a time-lapse film of blackberries growing, they are the thugs of the plant world. They just outcompete everybody and, shade them and just, crawl all over them and put their leaves out on top. It's just astonishing what they do. They got a very aggressive strategy for growing. But the thing I was going to say, the other thing is some of my most liberal friends have said, Chris, how about that whole gun thing, right? People who never would have thought about guns 3 months ago, hate them, we're really clear about this, settled science, my morality is clear on the subject, never shall we discuss this again, I've had a change of heart around this whole thing. And I think it's a combination of things, but it's really understanding that we're on our own, and there may be circumstances where you being able to protect your family is kind of depends on the tools you have for at least a period of time, before help can arrive and things like that. But at any rate, this is like cultural whiplash watching these people change their views on that, on what I thought was a really emotional subject for a lot of people. So to me, that's an element of that. It had a real turning, sort of a flavor, fourth turning, what I'm talking about. That's a real cultural shift that I've detected in my friend set.
Well, see, that's another business that doesn't have to worry about the future. Is the gun stores, right? They're going to be busy for a long time. And you know who became kind of weirdly a folk hero just lately is that guy with the chainsaw. Did you see that video?
Yeah, in McAllen, Texas, I think it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of people looked at that and said, well, okay, I get what he's doing. I would rather have a shotgun instead of a chainsaw, but okay, I get the concept. So that's a big part of gun demand going forward, I think.
Yeah. So chainsaws too.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, you're right. There will be industries that will do well. So, well, I know I've taken plenty of your time here today, and that's all the time we got. But thank you so much for your time here again. And
Chris, you know what? Anytime I could do this for hours with you. You are a very interesting guy to talk to, and we never get through a third of what we need to get through on
I
any of our
know.
shows. There's just not enough time to do it all.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, dollarcollapse.com. People can come by there and find your excellent stuff, and you've got a lot of
That's right.
articles that get run there. And are you working on a book?
No, I'm not, and I've been because it's been a while since the last one,
Yeah,
and maybe I'm just getting older, or maybe I feel like the story has been told of at least this whole thing. The subject of most of my previous books were kind of gloom and doomy, and now it's happening. And I find that it's not exactly writer's block, but I'm a lot less ambitious about writing when the stuff is coming true, because it's like, okay, it's already been said. Now, what can I short? What gold stock should I be buying? So I'm a lot more of a speculator now than I am a writer, because that's where the consequential stuff is. It's fun to write something that validates what's going on in the world, and then get feedback for it. Because it's suddenly kind of popular, but it's more fun to figure out what squiggle in the financial markets are going to happen next, and try to play it.
yeah.
So as long as I don't go bankrupt in the process, I'll be happy doing this for a while. But yeah, I think I might have one more book in me. So someday I'll come up with the idea. But right now, this is not the time.
Maybe a children's book, with like caterpillars and unicorns and stuff or something.
I once asked my agent about that. I had a friend who had an idea for a children's book, and I was going to write it with him. And she just said, no, just do what you're good at. Don't be doing. She probably hears that all the time from people who have one thing that they write about well,
Yeah.
and who want to branch out so they're not typecast. And for her, that's a huge amount of extra work, right? Trying to sell something from somebody who's never done that thing before. So she just shut me right down. But you're right. A kid's book would be fun to do.
All right. Well, hey, John, great talking to you again. We'll do it again soon, hopefully.
Hope so. Thanks, Chris.